We're excited to have several of the editors of the newest volume in the Joseph Smith Papers, Documents Volume 4, April 1834 to September 1835. As I mentioned, the two Alexes that aren't here, also Brenden Rensink and Max Parkin are with us, and Matt Godfrey is going to give them an introduction. I won't take the time now. But Matthew C. Godfrey is one of the general editors of the Joseph Smith Papers and is the managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers, a member of the editorial board, and has a PhD in American and Public History from Washington State University. He is the author of Religion, Politics, and Sugar, the Mormon Church, the Federal Government, and the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company, which was published in 2007, and which was a co-winner of one of the MHA awards, the Smith Pettit Award. Of course, you know that the Church Historians Press is the publisher of these volumes. Matt also has been involved with some of the other volumes. His name appears. And they're distributed by Deseret Book. They're fine quality books in every way, from the research and writing to the actual craftsmanship of the books themselves. These are envied far and wide, believe me, especially by those who are involved with other major papers projects. This has done very well in comparison, and is it safe to say that some of those people are a little bit jealous of the way that, and the sales, where we're talking about tens of thousands of copies of these all together, and some of the other papers that have been done in a major way throughout the country, you know, they might have a few hundred or maybe, you know, not many more than that perhaps in sales. It's pretty much a phenomenon, and to think that it's the papers of one who has been reviled for so long, it's really an amazing thing when you think about it. And so our hats are off to Larry Miller for helping this provide the seed money for this project, and for the LDS Church, and for Church Historians Press, and all the countless people really that have been involved in doing these volumes of papers. So with that, we again express our gratitude to have these fine men and historians and scholars with us tonight, and I'm going to turn the time now over to Matt Godfrey. How that goes.
All right.
You hear okay?
Okay. All right, before I get going, I'm just going to pull up the Joseph Smith Papers website. Because I would like to show you some documents tonight that are in Documents Volume 4 that I think are particularly interesting. It would help if I spelled it right. You would think I would know how to spell Joseph Smith. There we go. Much better. Well, I appreciate the chance to be with you tonight to talk a little bit about the Joseph Smith Papers, and particularly about this volume. I'm very pleased with this volume in our document series. It's one that we have been working on for many years. Max, when did you and Alex first start working on this?
It was 2001.
2001. So we're 15 years in the production of this volume. And Max and Alex Baugh were the first two historians on this volume, and did quite a lot of work on it. And then later on, myself and Brenden and Alex Smith were brought in and able to help bring the volume to its actual publication. So I think this volume covers a time period in church history and in the history of Joseph Smith where you really see Joseph Smith develop and kind of grow into his role as a prophet, as the leader of a major religious movement. Because you see in this time period Joseph struggling with some significant challenges to the church. In April of 1834, when this volume opens, of course it's just been a few months since the saints have been expelled from Jackson County, Missouri. And that kind of provides the main overarching theme for this time period. How the saints will be able to go back to Jackson County, how they will be able to redeem Zion. And most of the events that are covered in Documents Volume 4 touch on this notion of how are we supposed to redeem Zion? What do we do to get back into Jackson County? And even various things that these saints are doing in Kirtland, such as the construction of the house of the Lord, the publication of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, at least in some ways are indirectly affected by this desire to redeem Zion. Now, one of the major events that is covered in this volume is the Camp of Israel expedition, what we know today as Zion's Camp. And there are several documents in this volume that pertain to Zion's Camp, which, of course, is directly related to the redemption of Zion because it's the way that Joseph Smith believed that the saints would be able to regain their lands in Jackson County and then prevent mobs from expelling them from their lands again. So just a few documents that are in this volume that pertain to Zion's Camp that I'd like to highlight here. We have two letters that Joseph Smith wrote to Emma while he was on the Camp of Israel expedition. This first one here was written on May 18th, 1834. And it was essentially the first letter that Joseph had written to Emma while on the expedition. And this letter is in Joseph's handwriting. You can see that his signature was clipped off at some point, but this is in Joseph's handwriting. And we see in this letter, Joseph, he says in here that he's sensible of the duties of a husband and father, wants Emma to know that she is on his mind, wants her to know that he's well, and also talks in this letter about some of his relatives who were on the expedition, his brother-in-law Jenkins Salisbury, his brother William Smith, and cousins Jesse Smith, as well as George A. Smith. And so he talks in here kind of how the expedition is going up to this point. And then I like how he closes here. He says, "I must close, for I cannot write on my knees sitting on the ground to edification." So it must have been a little bit difficult for him as he's trying to write this letter as they are encamped in Indiana. There's also another letter to Emma dated June 4th, 1834. The only extant copy that we have of this letter is in Joseph Smith's letter book 2, so this one is not in his handwriting. And in that one, he talks more about what's going on with the expedition, even though there have been some significant challenges along the way, especially in the form of some disunity exhibited on the part of individuals such as Sylvester Smith and others. Joseph emphasizes to Emma that everything's well, they have plenty of food, everyone's united, and so it kind of seems like he's putting on a brave face to Emma at this time, not really wanting to reveal to her some of the challenges that they're facing. Now, one of the documents... Yeah.
Did Emma ever send a reply?
Not that we have that has survived to this day. If she wrote a letter to him, there's nothing that we have that has survived.
So the other church that she founded, it's not called the Reorganized
The
Church.
Community of Christ?
Do they have it? Anything?
No. Yeah, it's unfortunate because with Zion's Camp, one of the things that you find, we have, I think, roughly 9 documents in this volume that pertain to the Camp of Israel, and those are about the only contemporary documents that we have pertaining to that expedition. We have many reminiscences that people write about it. We have accounts such as George A. Smith's account, which tends to give a day-by-day breakdown of the Camp of Israel, but Smith wrote this many years after the fact. He wasn't writing it contemporaneously. And so that is one of the challenges that you face when you're dealing with the Camp of Israel, is just so much of it is what people remembered about it rather than documents that we have at the time. And kind of going along with that, we don't really have many records that clearly outline who members of the Camp of Israel were. There were some attempts to reconstruct the membership of the Camp of Israel in the 1860s that are made. But one of the great documents that we have in this volume is perhaps the only real contemporary listing of at least some of the membership of the Camp of Israel. So what happened on this journey, in order to fund the expedition, all of the participants on the expedition consecrated all of their money into a general fund. And we have, at least for the Kirtland contingent of the Camp of Israel, this account sheet that you see here that lists the donations that members of the Camp of Israel made to this general fund. So you have here Harrison Burgess contributed $4.50. John Sims Carter, 57 cents. Lyman Smith contributed nothing, nothing to contribute. George A. Smith, 75 cents. And it goes on and on. And so when you look at this, you have a reconstruction of at least some of the members of the Camp of Israel. This isn't a complete record of everyone who went on the Camp of Israel, but it at least is a start for historians to be able to have something that is contemporary outlining who actually went on the expedition. One of the other notable things that you see in this document is that at the very bottom of the listing of donations of members of the Camp of Israel, there's this notation here. Jane Clark gave $50. And when you look at this account sheet, $50 is the second largest amount that anyone contributed to the Camp of Israel. The only larger amount was a donation of, I think, $170 that was made by John Tanner. And so in researching who Jane Clark was, we find that she was a single sister that lived in the Eugene, Indiana branch. She probably actually didn't march with the Camp of Israel. She probably made this donation when Parley P. Pratt and others stopped in Eugene on the way to Missouri. There's an account that George A. Smith gives that Parley P. Pratt came back from the Eugene branch with some funds, and that probably included the $50 that Jane Clark gave. But this is kind of a remarkable thing that you have this single woman who donated a rather large sum of money to the Camp of Israel, and someone about which we wish that we knew more, but we at least know a little bit about her and about who she was, at least where she lived at the time. So this is one of my favorite documents that we have in Documents Volume 4, is this ledger of donations that were made to the Camp of Israel. And on the other side of it, you also have disbursements that were made to the different captains of the companies of the Camp of Israel in order to purchase supplies. So I think this is something that is quite valuable for historians. And it's not something that has been widely used by historians prior to its publication in this volume. Yeah?
What does that bottom line mean? Something this amount to balance?
Yeah, so this account ledger was produced in accordance with another account that's also included in here. And so in order to reconcile the amounts that were actually donated to the Camp of Israel and that were actually expended, one of the things that they did, because there was, I think, a $391 shortage in the amount that was donated and the amount that was expended. And so this says that to balance the account, there's this 391 amount, which is supposed to be on a different account sheet. So it's just a way that they were able to balance it to show that the disbursements equaled the amount that they brought in.
Do you know where that is in the printed book?
Let's see. It would be on page... begins on page 135
Thank you.
in the book. All right. The other interesting document, I think, that pertains to the Camp of Israel as well, is we do have minutes of several different councils that were held in Kirtland in August of 1834 after members of the Camp of Israel had returned. Sylvester Smith, who was a member of the Kirtland High Council and was on the expedition, after he got back from the Camp of Israel, he charged Joseph Smith with various improprieties while leading the camp, said that he was guilty of essentially embezzling money that was contributed, that he was also guilty of insulting Sylvester's character. And so there were several councils that were held in Kirtland about this. And eventually Sylvester Smith is actually tried for his membership for making these accusations against Joseph Smith. And so we have the minutes of these meetings that are held, and some of the minutes of 29 August 1834, present a rather detailed history of some of the events that took place during the Camp of Israel expedition. And so again, it's a good way, a good source for historians to be able to reconstruct from a contemporary source what actually happened on the expedition. So that's something else that I think is neat in this. Now, when the Camp of Israel was disbanded in June of 1834, one of the reasons why it is disbanded is that Joseph Smith dictates a revelation on June 22nd, 1834, and in that revelation it says that it's no longer required of the camp to redeem Zion at that point. And there's various reasons that are given in the revelation for this, and the revelation is in Documents Volume 4 as well. But a couple of the things is that the revelation says that it is not expedient for the camp or for Zion to be redeemed until the elders of the church are endowed with power, until the Lord's people are taught more perfectly, and until a blessing had been poured out on those who had volunteered for the Camp of Israel. And so over the next several months, you see some of these things, Joseph Smith and other church leaders working to try to fulfill some of these things that they're told to do in this revelation. Did you have a question?
Do we know who the accountant was keeping these records?
So Frederick G. Williams was the treasurer for the Camp of Israel, but these records are actually in Orson Hyde's hand, because for the Sylvester Smith trial, Orson Hyde took Frederick G. Williams' records and he made the copy that we have, this ledger book, and then presented it as evidence to the Kirtland High Council that was trying Sylvester Smith.
And the reason that they had to keep these detailed records were the charges against Joseph from some quarters that he was embezzling?
That's why Orson Hyde made the copy and submitted it. Frederick G. Williams, though, had made his own records throughout the journey. And I think the reason was probably because they did consider these funds sacred because people had consecrated to them, so they wanted to make sure that there was an account made of what they did with the funding.
That they'd get credit in heaven.
Sure, yeah, that was probably part of it as well, yeah. So one of the things, this notion of the elders being endowed with power, that wouldn't happen until the Kirtland House of the Lord was constructed. And so throughout this time period from April 1834 through September of 1835 that's covered in this volume, you see Joseph Smith and others continually working to keep the construction of the Kirtland House of the Lord going. And they do so with some significant financial challenges. that they have. The church is heavily in debt for much of this period due to various reasons. Some of those reasons are because the storehouse that they were operating in Independence, Missouri, they no longer had possession of because of the expulsion, and yet they still owed money on the goods that were in the store. Another reason is because the printing shop, the printing office in Independence was destroyed. They had to purchase a new printing press, new type, and get a new printing office up and running in Kirtland. And another reason was just the land purchased where the Kirtland House of the Lord would be constructed. They purchased that land for $5,000 and still owed $3,000 on it for this time period. And then just the materials that were necessary in order to construct the house of the Lord. And so we see in this volume Joseph Smith struggling with trying to stay afloat financially and relying on donations from church members and other sources in order to keep the temple construction going. And one of the documents that I really like in this volume are minutes of a meeting that was held before the Kirtland High Council in November of 1834. And at this time, these minutes deal with a branch of the church that had decided that they needed to come together in fasting and prayer and donate money to the church. And this branch was located in Lewis, New York, and they sent two representatives, official representatives, Joseph Tippett and John Tippett, to Kirtland with roughly $800. And what they were planning on initially doing with the $800 is they were going to go to Missouri and purchase land there. Because one of the things that the saints had been instructed to do in December 1833 and again in February 1834 in two revelations dictated at that time was that they were supposed to gather together money and then send wise men to Missouri to purchase lands there. And that this would be a way, again, to redeem Zion. So these members of the Lewis branch got together and they decided that they would try to fulfill the instructions in this revelation, and they sent these men to Kirtland. When they got to Kirtland, they met with the Kirtland High Council, and they asked the Kirtland High Council whether they should keep on going to Missouri or whether they should stay in Kirtland for the winter, since it was already the end of November. The Kirtland High Council told them that it was probably more meet for them to stay in Kirtland for the winter and not to go to Missouri until the following summer. So they decided to do that, to follow that instruction. But then the Kirtland High Council said, since you won't need the money to purchase the lands in Missouri until the following summer, could you loan some of that to Joseph Smith so that he could pay off some of these debts that he had? So they got together and they said yes, they would be willing to do this. Now the interesting thing about this story is that of the money that they loaned to Joseph Smith, let's see if I can find it here, which was roughly about $480 or so, they determined that of that money that was going to be loaned to Joseph Smith, that $149.75 of it was held or in the possession of Sister Caroline Tippett, who was the sister, I believe, of Joseph H. Tippett, one of the wise men that had been sent. And so the High Council called Sister Tippett in because she had come with her brother and her cousin. And as she was before the High Council, they asked whether she would be willing to loan that money, $149.75, to Joseph Smith. She said she would. A note was then drawn for her saying that Joseph Smith would pay back the money in time. And so again, here you have another woman who is donating a significant amount of money to the church. And when you look at who Caroline Tippett was, she was only 22 years old at the time. Again, she's from Lewis, New York. We don't really know how she had this amount of money to loan to Joseph Smith, where she got it from. But this was something that was greatly needed. This money was greatly needed by Joseph Smith, so much so that the following day, November 29th, 1834, he and Oliver Cowdery kneel down before the Lord. They give thanks for this money that has come to them, and they make a covenant with the Lord that if he gets them out of debt, that they would be willing from that time forward to give a tenth of what they had to the poor, or for whatever other means the Lord required of them. Now, of course, the law of tithing isn't in place at this time, and wouldn't be for several more years. And Joseph never did get out of debt at this point, so it's not likely that he ever really fulfilled this covenant, because he never was out of debt. But it just shows how much gratitude they felt for the Lewis branch for being able to loan them the money at this time. Yeah?
What would the inflation rate be from those dollars to our dollars?
That's a good question. I don't have a conversion rate for it. We do know that at the time, a male day laborer in the Northeast was probably making somewhere just over $200 a year. And for female day laborers, they were probably making only half that much, if that amount. So the 150 is a fairly significant amount of money at the time that Caroline had. All right. Well, just quickly, just a couple of other things that are highlighted in this volume. One of the things is the calling of the 12 apostles and the calling of the first members of the 70, which occurs in February of 1835. And we have in this volume both the minutes of the meeting where the 12 apostles are called, the minutes of the meeting where the 70 are called, but then we also have transcripts of their ordination blessings, which were recorded into the minute book along with the minutes of these meetings. And so it's fairly interesting to be able to go in and see some of the texts of these ordination blessings. In these blessings, the members of the 12 and the 70 were all made great promises of proselytizing success, of even financial rewards if they continued faithful in the church. And so it's interesting to be able to read some of these blessings, another interesting component of this. And then finally, as I mentioned, one of the things that the revelation that disbanded Zion's camp stated was that the saints needed to be taught more perfectly. And I think one way that Joseph Smith tried to fulfill this direction was through the publication of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And so we have documents in this volume that pertain to the publication of the Doctrine and Covenants. We have the minutes of the September 24th, 1834 meeting where the Kirtland High Council appointed Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Frederick G. Williams, and Oliver Cowdery as the committee to put together the Doctrine and Covenants. We have the preface to the Doctrine and Covenants that those four composed in February of 1835. And then we have minutes of the August 1835 meeting, General Assembly of the Church, where the Doctrine and Covenants was presented to the church for its affirming vote. So all of these are in this volume, and they're all things that I think are helpful in understanding better the history of the compilation of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. One last thing that I want to point out, and then we can open it up for questions. One of the interesting things about this time period is that it seems to be a period where blessings hold a particular interest to the church and a particular interest to Joseph Smith. And I think some of this pertains to the fact that Joseph Smith Sr. Really starts giving patriarchal blessings in December of 1834. He blesses Joseph and Emma Smith at that time, along with his other children and their spouses. And we have the text of Joseph and Emma's blessings in Documents Volume 4. And this kind of ushers in what I call a season of blessings, where you have numerous church meetings that are held in 1835 where participants are blessed for various reasons. Some are like the 12 apostles in the 70 that are given ordination blessings that are then recorded. Others, the members of the Camp of Israel, are given what are called Zion blessings. Blessings particularly given to them because they participated in the Camp of Israel expedition. In September of 1835, Joseph Smith gives blessings to David Whitmer, William W. Phelps, John Whitmer, and John Corll, 4 of the Missouri leaders who were in Kirtland at that time. And these blessings are recorded as well. And you even have Oliver Cowdery, who in September of 1835, after he's been appointed the recorder of the church and has started to record these blessings into what we call Patriarchal Blessing Book 1, after he's done this for some period, Oliver even pens his own blessing to Joseph Smith himself, which makes great promises to Joseph Smith. And so it's very interesting to kind of see how blessings are operating at this time in 1834 and 1835, and how important they are to members of the church and to Joseph Smith. They seem to kind of die out as the approach of the dedication of the Kirtland House of the Lord comes in 1836. But for a significant period of time in 1835, blessings and meetings where blessings are given seem to be very important to the church and to Joseph Smith. So I hope that you all find Documents Volume 4 interesting. This was just kind of to try to give a brief overview and a taste of some of the documents that we have in there. And myself and Brenden and Max will be happy to try to answer any questions you have for us. Any questions? Yeah, please.
How many volumes will eventually be produced, do you know?
So for the entire Joseph Smith papers, we estimate there will probably be around 25 or 26 volumes that are produced. There'll probably be around 15 volumes in the document series itself that we'll be producing. Yeah.
In view of the fact that apparently Joseph Smith was indebted on these loans, is there any evidence that he was selling anything to raise money to pay them off? Like in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church sold indulgences to raise money. Mm-hmm. Were the Joseph Smith or the others selling anything to raise money? How were they trying to raise money to pay off these loans?
Yeah. It doesn't appear that they were really trying to sell much during this time period. They seem to be focusing more on getting loans and on relying on donations from church members and from other sources. Now, in later time periods, 1836 and 1837, they reach a point where they mortgage the Kirtland Temple in order to try to raise money to take care of some of their debts. But during this time period of 1834 and 35, they're mainly relying on loans and donations.
Who took that mortgage on the Kirtland Temple?
It was a firm, Mead, Osborne, and Perkins, I believe, a New York firm.
And why?
Why did they take the mortgage, or why did he mortgage it? Or
no, why did the firm? Were they Mormons?
No.
So what was their incentive to take?
Well, if they defaulted on the loan and didn't provide the money back to them, then they would have possession of the building, which would have been seen as a valuable building.
And they thought it was just a really beautiful building. And of course, it was a beautiful building.
Sure, yeah.
So, in a prime spot. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Gary?
Matt, would you explain how the four of you, what you did and how you tackled this and what each of your responsibilities were?
Sure. Max, you can probably speak better as to the way you and Alex worked to begin.
No. Alex Ball, BYU professor of history there, and I was a past institute teacher at the University of Utah. We're teamed together to do the initial historical background for the documents. We got the documents we worked on from the central office, which had provided us a typescript. And our job then was to verify the accuracy of the typescript with the originals, so that everything was perfect on the copy that would be reproduced. Oh, thank you. Would be reproduced, and Alex checked my work and I checked Alex's work, and consequently then when we finished our task we turned it back to the office and to the historical department, and then Matt and others took it from that point and added their particular editorial insight.
So Matt, was the decision about which documents to include already made before you and Alex started working?
Yes, the ones that we worked with were already collected, identified, typescripts were created. If we knew of others, we were invited, of course, to contribute those. So it was not a closed-end thing. And later, after we turned our work over to the central office, historical department, then they did find some few other additional ones which they added and contributed to as well. May I make a comment about historical documents that may be of interest to you? It was in 1956, this will take just a few minutes, but I think it's an important insight. In 1956, BYU and the church realized that their Seminary and Institute program was going to go much wider than it had been, into more broadly in the United States, into Europe, into Asia. And consequently, in 1956, the university established a new graduate school at BYU. This graduate school was designed, it was in religious education, it was designed to train institute and seminary teachers, granting them master's degrees and doctor's degrees in various fields. They made some kind of agreement with the historical department. Joseph Fielding Smith was the historian. William Lund was his assistant church historian at the time. And we as graduate students got permission to go into the church archives and use some of their documents. Let me just make a point of contrast. In those days, the historical department was on the third floor of the church office building. Joseph Fielding Smith's office, next to it was a little reading room. Next to it was the stacks in another room, and then a little aisle or hall with some desks on it where the BYU students or scholars working for a degree which they had been approved of were able to look at documents. The routine in those days was that we would take a document from the archive over to our little desk. We would then copy down by hand onto a card anything we wanted to keep. We'd turn all those cards over to President Smith's assistant, Brother Lund, to read. The next day we would go into Brother Lund and get those back to us, the ones that were approved. Most of them, of course, were approved, but they were very, very tightly controlled. I remember one day when I was in Brother Lund's office to pick up some cards that I had made the previous day. We went through each one of those cards. That's okay. That's okay. You can have that. Uh-oh. Here's one you cannot have. Rip. Threw it into the wastebasket. And so we were lucky to get what we wanted because there was kind of a persecution complex in the historical department concerning our past and how people would use the documents and what have you. One day when I was on my desk looking at a document, the document was the Curlin letter book, which contains the letters produced in the church, copied down. And then on the back of it, oh my gosh, was another record. Not knowing it then, it was the 1832 history of Joseph Smith, with the 1832 account of the first vision. I read that and I was stunned by it. What does that mean? Well, Brother Lund, he would walk up and down that aisle and he would see if we were reading the very page he had assigned us or we had gotten permission to read. And if we were not reading that page, he would grab the document out of our hands, scold us. You know, it was a very embarrassing kind of thing. Down at the end of the hall was Dean Jesse. He had just been employed by Joseph Fielding Smith to examine documents of Joseph Smith. He was in a little wire mesh room with a locked door. And whenever that happened, he would come and put his head down. He was embarrassed. We're all embarrassed. That was the situation. Later, when I worked on my doctor's degree, by that time Leonard Arrington now is church historian, and we were given permission to look at any document, photograph it, copy it, Xerox it. It was a wonderful change. And it was because of Dean Jesse's work in that little cubby hole of a screened room and the change of the church policy with Leonard Arrington that all of this came about. I wanted to give you that contrast so you understand some of the dynamics of what happened over those years.
Thank you.
I had a couple questions. One's kind of a follow-up to that question. I noticed on the document series, there's different editors for each book, and then there's also the general editors that do the whole, I guess, in charge of the whole project.
Right.
Can you talk about how that's set up and how they determine who does which volumes and?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so we have different volume teams that are working on volumes. We have anywhere from about, well, we probably have about 7 volumes that are in production in some form or another at once. And so each volume team is set up with someone that we designate as a lead historian, who's kind of the one in charge of the overall volume. And then each volume will usually have the lead historian and then 2 co-volume editors, 2 other historians that are also working on them. So they work to do, third level transcriptions of the documents, because we try to verify each transcript 3 different times to make sure that it's accurate. So they'll work on that, then they'll work on annotating the documents and in writing historical introductions to those documents to put them in their historical context. And then once they have documents drafted in that form, then they will pass them off to a senior review editor that we have. And in the past, that was Richard Jensen. Richard retired last year, and so Mark Ashurst McGee is our current review editor. And he will go through and make comments and, put questions down. Have you considered this? Have you looked at this source? Things like that. And then when he's done, the documents go to the general editors of the project, who are myself, Matt Groh, and Ron Esplin. And we will also read through and provide comments and provide kind of a peer review of the volume. Once it goes to that point, there's some copy editing that's done on it. Then it's sent out for further review from our National Advisory Board, as well as from various general authorities who look at it as well. And then when it comes back, the editors answer questions that are raised, and then it goes through some further copy editing. And so it's kind of heavily reviewed before it actually comes out as a publication.
Like this volume, for instance, we finished most of the work on this one by the summer of 2014.
Probably drafted it, but
And we were working on the source notes and stuff. And so from then it takes another 2 years of more edits and copy editing, and it's a process.
It is a process. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
This is for all of you, but were there anything that you, when you were going through all the documents and that, and the things that you read, was there anything that caught any of you by surprise, or that was of extreme interest to you, or?
You want to take that first? For a second.
Yeah, which story? One thing, I actually went back this afternoon and kind of went through all the documents that I had worked on, and because it was about 2 years ago, I wanted to refresh my memory of what work I had done back in 2013. And I was struck by, not by how little we know about the period, but how some of the ways in which we've packaged our historical narratives in the decades and more than a century since has often been somewhat divorced from the historical reality of the time. And now that we go and we sit down with the actual documents, we find out that, for instance, with all these patriarchal blessings, that there wasn't a set in stone process by which patriarchal blessings were solicited, given, recorded, shared or not shared, like we have today, but we sometimes take our current understanding of a doctrine or an idea and assume it was like that back then, but when we really sit with these documents, we see that these policies and practices are very much in flux and not quite settled yet. And as I was going through some things this afternoon, I was struck again and again by, wow, things really are in a dynamic state of evolution in doctrines, policies, all kinds of things. So it's kind of fun in this volume, especially in some of the deep annotation, to see all the different possible trajectories in which things could have gone. We know which way a lot of these things did go, but this is a moment in which things could have gone in so many different ways. It's exciting stuff to look at.
Just kind of following on what Brenden was saying, one of the things that he discovered that I thought was very interesting is that when Oliver Cowdery is appointed recorder for these patriarchal blessings, he actually charged people, is it 10 cents per 100 words?
Portfolio, yeah.
Yeah, so he charged people 10 cents per 100 words to actually record the blessing in the church's official patriarchal blessing book. And I had not been aware that was a practice at the time.
And some stories, there are some accounts that suggested to get their own personal copy, they had to pay as well.
But that's great. That you had to raise the money to pay off the loans.
Right.
I like that way of thinking, you know.
Yeah, Gary.
Are there any documents that you know that are supposed to exist but that you could just never find?
That's a good question. Max, do you know of anything?
Well, I'll think of that. Nothing comes up quickly.
I do know, just in terms of Zion's camp, we do have in George A. Smith's record, he says that Frederick G. Williams kept a history of the camp at the time, but then he says that record was lost. So that's something that we do know was created at some point, but we don't have it anymore today. Other than that, I mean, periodically you'll have references either in letters or in other documents of, oh, I received this letter from you, and we don't have that letter anymore. So there are things like that.
On that one ledger, it looked like there was a total at the bottom of $2,000 something. Did they end up, I guess, using all of that, or was some of that left over when they made it back to Kirtland?
So at the end of the expedition, when it was disbanded in Missouri, each participant received $1.14 from this general fund, which was kind of the leftover amount, and that's what they had to rely on to get back to Kirtland. So not very much remained at the end of it.
It seems like as scholars such as yourselves, this would be sort of a dream project to work on, this volume particularly. Is there anything about this volume that you just kind of disliked, or that was really frustrating or particularly difficult to handle?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that you're willing to talk about, I guess.
Well, I guess one thing that we do have in this volume, we do have 5 appendix items in the volume, and these are items for which Joseph Smith's authorship is questionable for various reasons. And so we have in there a broadside of the first lecture on faith to kind of represent the lectures on faith. We have 2 items from the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, the Statement on Marriage and the Declaration of Laws and Government, that are in there. We have a letter that was published in the Messenger and Advocate that appears to be based on a letter that Joseph Smith, William W. Phelps, John Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery had written to John Burke in Missouri on June 1st, 1835. But then Phelps seems to have taken that letter and changed a lot of the language in it before it was published in the Messenger and Advocate. And we don't know whether Joseph was involved at all with those changes or if Phelps just did it. So that's another appendix item. And then kind of going along with that, there are several blessings that Joseph Smith gave to family members in 1833 that at the time were recorded in his journal. But then in 1835, Oliver Cowdery recorded these same blessings into the Patriarchal Blessing Book. And if you compare what Oliver Cowdery recorded with what's in Joseph's journal, these blessings are greatly expanded in the Patriarchal Blessing Book. And again, it's an item where we don't really know if Joseph was involved with that at all. Did he authorize Oliver Cowdery to do it? Was he helping Oliver Cowdery do it? Or did Cowdery just do it as he was recording the blessings? So I think with some of these items, just kind of trying to determine exactly what Joseph Smith's role was in producing some of the documents was sometimes difficult. And in some cases, you know, we just had to say, we don't really know how involved he was, which is always frustrating for a historian or a documentary editor to have to admit that you don't know something. Yeah.
I mean, also, if you look at these first 4 volumes in the document series, and you look at the years covered, some of them cover, I mean, we cover a little over a year, right? A year and a half?
About a year and a half.
Or so. And so there's a lot of things happening for which we don't have Joseph Smith documents that we can feature. Whereas as the series moves forward and we get to, you know, documents volume 10, once we get into the Nauvoo period, and it's just almost too many documents. So our frustration during some of these early volumes is we know there are things happening, and from all kinds of weird angles we can piece together sometimes what was happening, but we don't have some of the documents that maybe did exist once don't. Later, maybe they'll have the problem of having too many documents to have to sift through, but I think that was at least a frustration I felt all the time. It's like, I know that someone wrote exactly what I'm looking for. They wrote it down, and you know, it's lost in time now.
There's one document, actually several documents that pertains to one topic that I'd like to just refer to. The idea, the concept I want to develop a little bit, actually is discussed in the previous volume, 1832. So I want to go back to 1832 quickly. In 1832, as you remember, the church had 2 centers of activity. One was at Kirtland and one was out in Independence, Missouri. The church owned properties in both places, either that which had been consecrated to the church or that which the church had purchased. For example, in Kirtland was the Newell K. Whitney store. We had some property lots and some farms there, which the church owned, or church leaders owned. Out in Missouri, we had the church press, we had a church store, and the consecrated lands that formed 5 Mormon villages in Jackson County. That was owned by Bishop Partridge. Well, the point I'm making is that the church owned a lot of assets in 1832, and so consequently, Joseph received a revelation to gather a group of brethren at Kirtland, go out to Independence, Missouri, and to establish a new business organization, a firm, if you will, called the United Firm. And he appointed 12 different, we would call them directors of the United Firm. Joseph Smith and other church leaders were officers in this United Firm. Over the next 2 years, there were revelations that described or talked about this United Firm. Also, there were letters written about this United Firm. Now, keep in mind, that's a business management firm to simply manage and direct the church's assets. In 1834, in this document, section 104 of the Doctrine and Covenants, was the revelation to discontinue this church business, United Firm. The next year, Joseph, of course, had the brethren prepare the revelations for the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. In 1835, Joseph was very much concerned, apparently, that all those letters and documents, the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants that talked about the United Firm, might be used by his enemies, by his creditors, in some way in courts. And so Joseph did not want those revelations published as they have been recorded using the word United Firm that identified this business of the churches. So consequently, they came up with 25, 26 different false names, pseudonyms, fictitious names, that's the term that Parley Pratt uses, to identify any business activity, such as money or places or people, concerning the United Firm over the past several years. And when they published the Doctrine and Covenants, then they used these code names instead of the original names of the proprietors of the United Firm and the businesses and so forth, so they could disguise it for any nefarious use by their creditors in courts. Consequently, Joseph gave to the term United Firm a new name, called it United Order. United Order never existed. It did not exist in the history of this church. What did exist was a business management firm called the United Firm. Now, one might say, well, what difference does it make whether you use the term United Firm or United Order? I think it makes a lot of difference, because the term United Order suggests some kind of esoteric, spiritual, supernatural, end-of-the-world sort of thing. United Firm is just like Zion Securities or some other church operation of our day. That's all it was. Now, Joseph received revelations to direct the managers of the United Firm, and in 1834, of course, all the assets were redistributed back to the original owners to manage their own properties again. But in the Doctrine and Covenants, 5 revelations, which deal with the United Firm, Joseph had all those revelations changed to use these pseudonyms or these false names or these alternate terms so that they wouldn't cause trouble. They were left in the Doctrine and Covenants, of course, for years and years until finally in the 1981 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, most of them were removed and the original names were restored, and by now they're all restored. This is significant because in the new 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, I think through the effects of the Joseph Smith papers and Matt and others, the heading in those revelations that pertain to the United Firm all contain the words United Order throughout those revelations still. And the reason why they've retained the United Order names, because that was the last names that Joseph applied to them. And so we've retained the more recent terms that Joseph used. But in the headings of 2 revelations, section 70A, I believe, and 104, you'll find that the brethren that produced the 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants have acknowledged in the introduction that the term United Order was just a fictitious term, and the real term that is used in the history of the church, in the letters and in the revelations, was the United Firm, not the United Order. The United Order never existed in this church, ever, in Missouri or Illinois. Now, it did exist later in Utah in a different form under Brigham Young, but it has nothing to do with the prophet Joseph and the early church.
Interesting.
I'm really glad Max brought that up, because it's largely Max's work on this that we were able to restore some of that information to the headings in the 2013 edition of the Scriptures. And if you haven't read Max's article in BYU Studies on the United Firm, you need to read that. I think that came out in 2007, if I remember right. Because this really is something, if you read section 78, 82, and 104 of the Doctrine and Covenants especially, you come away with a very skewed idea of what was really going on with these revelations when they were given. And so it's through Max's work that we've been able to figure out more about the United Firm and be able to understand those revelations better as they were dictated by Joseph Smith.
What was the Community of Christ Church involved at all in this whole, in all these series? Or?
Yeah. So we have a good working relationship with the Community of Christ. There are some documents that we reproduce in this volume that are in the Community of Christ possession. That May 18th, 1834 letter from Joseph to Emma is one of those. And they have given us permission to publish these documents and to put them on our website. So we have a good working relationship with them, and we, consult with them frequently on things, especially on documents that are in their possession that we're reproducing.
Do they get royalties on some of that kind of stuff, or
We-
they paid up front, or?
Well, we have kind of a working agreement with them where we do conservation work on some of their documents for them. So that's kind of how the relationship works. Yeah.
So, it sounds like the volume takes place in the 1834 era,
Yeah.
but during your research, has there been any papers or journals that you found that's trying to cover up the plural marriage idea? Because back then, I'm sure they were prosecuted for it. So I'm just wondering if they use maybe secret journals when they reporting the patriarchal blessings
Sure.
of these wives and children, if that was kept secret, or was it made known to the people
Right.
back then as they were recording?
So Gary could probably answer this better than I could because he is more of an authority on plural marriage than I am. But I'll just say for our time period, the 1834-35 time period, plural marriage doesn't appear in any of the contemporary documents. Now, it's probably in 1835 that Joseph married Fanny Alger, but in the contemporary documents that we have, there's no mention of that. And I know, Brenden, you did some work on Fanny Alger, so I don't know if you want to
Yeah,
add anything.
in the well, one reason the statement on marriage that they include in that 1835 Doctrine and Covenants is in direct response to accusations of adultery and plural marriage. But in the existing documentation, there's not really any discussion of it. Now, in years later, there's plenty of projecting back onto that 1834-1835 era about what was going on with Fanny Alger. There's some recollections which say it was actually, and there's a large footnote on this in one of the documents. It was actually Oliver Cowdery who was first practicing plural marriage, but without Joseph's permission. But these again are all recollections from later on, looking back. But at the time, there's nothing we can find.
So, plural marriage started in 1835. Is that what you found?
We don't have an exact date for Fanny Alger. We assume it's probably sometime in that 1835 period. And then, of course, I don't think Joseph marries another plural wife until 1841. Is that right, Gary? So, and I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to this.
I just assume that in like the next volume or 2 or 3, you're going to have to deal with the allegations of Fanny Alger and
Yeah.
Oliver Cowdery and all.
Books being sold by the Community of Christ in their bookstores.
Yeah, some of them are. I was just back in Nauvoo about 3 weeks ago, and there are several Joseph Smith paper volumes that they have in their Nauvoo Visitor Center, the bookstore there.
They did a Kirtland as well when we met.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate